I will promise you, once you've watched that video, from the beginning until the end, you will know the difference between ISO, shutter speed and aperture. I will explain you how to do sport photography. I will explain you how to do macro photography. I will explain you how to get that blur background. And last but not missing topic, I'm going to explain you how to do long time exposures for night photography. Boys and girls, welcome to that really long video. I mean, at the moment it's not long because I just started to record this video, but today it's all about photography. And guess what? It doesn't matter if you are new in photography, if you have already a camera, if you are using your phone at the moment, if you have a camera for 6,000 euro or a camera for 500 euro or US dollars. It doesn't matter if you have such a small compact camera with a manual mode. In this video, I'm going to explain you how to expose correctly. If you ever wondered how is it possible to get a blur background, how is it possible to take macro shots, why do I have so much grain in my photo, I'm going to explain you everything from A to Z. I will explain you what type of lenses you need. I will explain you what kind of a camera you need. I will explain you the difference between an aps-c sensor camera and a full frame camera. This video is made for everyone who is into photography or would love to be into photography. I started like 10 years ago with my first camera for about 500 bucks, and I was like always like, how is it possible to do an underexposure? How is it possible to do a long time exposure? I will explain you all of my knowledge that I learned within the last 10 years in that video. I'm going to explain you in this video everything that you require to take a perfect photo. So it doesn't really matter if you're 10 years old and you borrowed the camera of your father. It doesn't really matter if you're 80 years old and you just got a new camera from your kids. It doesn't really matter if you have your own coffee shop running and you always wanted to have these great Instagram photos that everyone just loves. Or you're a portrait photographer, or you would like to be a portrait photographer, and you were always wondering how is it possible to get that blur background. So in this video I'm going to explain you everything you need for photography. Now enjoy this video. It doesn't matter if you have a Sony, a Nikon, a Canon, a Pentax, a Fujifilm. It doesn't really matter if you have a film camera or a digital camera. The principle is the same since the last, I don't know, 100 years. I will take all my photos in this video with Canon and Sony, but as I told you, it doesn't really matter if you have a small camera that has a manual mode or if you have a Nikon camera for 500 bucks or 5,000 bucks. The principle is always the same. So here's a camera that you can probably find on the internet for about 500 to 600 euro. That's the Canon EOS 77D with an aps-c sensor in it. So that's the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II. This camera costs 6,300 euros or more than 6,000 US dollars. This camera has a full frame sensor, so a bigger sensor. Here is my Sony Alpha 7 Mark III. It has also a full frame sensor, but as you can see, there's no mirror in here, so that's a mirrorless camera. This is the 18 to 135 millimeter lens. You will find that lens in a lot of kit versions out there. So if you purchase a camera like the Canon EOS 77D, you most have the option to choose between two kit lenses. First of all, there's the 18 to 55 millimeter or the 18 to 135 millimeter. More millimeter means more zoom, less millimeters means less zoom. So this camera in combination with this lens is about 1,000 bucks, while this camera with this lens is about 7,000 to 8,000 bucks. But where is the difference and where is the price coming from? Let's start with the Canon EOS 1DX. Make sure you always wear that cap on top of your camera body once you have no lens connected to it, because otherwise there is a high chance that you can get some dust particles onto your camera sensor and you will see them on your final image as well. Make sure not to clean it by yourself. Always go to a professional camera store and let it do by these professional guys. So let me explain you how that works. Once you attach a lens onto your camera, you have that mirror down here which reflects upwards. While looking through your viewfinder, you will exactly see what your lens sees at this moment. And as I told you a couple seconds ago, that's a full frame sensor. That's not the sensor, that's just a mirror. The sensor is behind it, but I'm going to show you the sensor in a second. So here is the full frame sensor of the Canon EOS 1DX. So that's my Sony Alpha 7 III. As you can see, here's the sensor without any protecting mirror in front of it. And that's a mirrorless camera. So once you look through that viewfinder here, it's an electronic viewfinder, which allows you to see straight away your final image and your exposure. And that's also a full frame sensor. While this camera here, the EOS 77D, features an aps-c sensor. As you can see, I'm going to take now the 1DX next to it. It has the same mounting like the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II, but the sensor is much smaller. I will do that side by side. So, I mean, at the moment you can only see the mirror, but once I turn on the camera, let me do that for you very quick. Here's that little tiny sensor, while this camera has a huge sensor. So what is the advantage of an aps-c sensor camera? First of all, it's the price. It's much cheaper than a full frame camera. Another advantage is on an aps-c sensor camera, you have many more lenses out there that you can use. Either you use the lenses from Canon, Nikon or Sony, or you use the lenses from third-party manufacturers like Sigma and Tamron. Another advantage is that the lenses for aps-c sensor cameras are most of the time much cheaper than the lenses for full-frame cameras. Another point to notice is the crop factor that you have with an aps-c sensor camera. What a crop factor is, I'm going to show you that in a few moments. One major disadvantage of having an aps-c sensor camera instead of a full frame camera is its size. So you can imagine, the bigger the window is, the more light comes through, the smaller the window is, the less light comes through. If you're taking photos at night with an aps-c sensor camera, with an ISO value of, let's say, 3200, and then you take exactly the same photo with the same lens at the exact same ISO value, you see less grain on the full frame image than with the aps-c sensor image. Next point to notice is blurry background. You all know the photos where the background is blurred out. That depends mainly on the lens you're using, and secondly, on the size of your camera sensor. The bigger the sensor is, the more blur background you will get. You will get less blur background with a smaller sensor. The advantage of having a full frame camera is that you don't have any crop factor. As I told you, I'm going to show you what a crop factor does in a few moments, but let's bear that in mind, you don't have any crop factor on a full frame camera. So the focal length that you use on a full frame camera, like 24mm, is exactly 24mm on the final image. If you use a 24mm lens on an aps-c sensor camera, you have to multiply it by either 1.5 with Nikon cameras or 1.6 with Canon cameras, and I guess it's also 1.5 or 1.6 using Sony cameras. So it seems that you would have zoomed in, but that's not true, because an aps-c sensor is much smaller than a full frame sensor, and therefore it looked like that you would have zoomed in, but in fact you didn't. But I'm going to show you that in a few moments, and then you will exactly see what I was talking about. Blur background. That's also more possible using a full frame camera. Taking photos at night, it's better to have a full frame camera instead of an aps-c sensor camera. Why? Because once you take photos at night and you need to push the ISO, that I'm going to explain you in a few moments as well, really high on a full frame camera, you will see less grain on the final image than on an image taken with an aps-c sensor camera. One downside of a full frame camera is that you can't use all the lenses out there. Most of the lenses made for full frame cameras are more expensive than the lenses built for aps-c sensor cameras. So here are all various types of lenses. Thanks to Canon Germany for supporting me in this video here. First of all, Let's start from the right to the left. So that's an 18 to 35 millimeter lens. That's one of the kit lenses you can expect to get with all the cheaper cameras out there. That's a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. So that's a zoom lens. You can zoom from 70 to 200 millimeter. This kit lens probably costs about 300 euros, while this lens here costs about 1500 euros. Here is a macro lens, a 35 millimeter lens, and it's called macro because you can get really close to all your subjects, like a butterfly, like food or jewelry. This lens here is a 50 millimeter lens, so there's no minus in between, so that means you can't zoom with that lens. However, it's a fixed focal length with a fast aperture, and what that does, I will explain you that in a second. So a 50 millimeter lens, and this lens costs about $2,500, while this lens here is available for $500. Here's also a 50 millimeter lens, but it's using a different aperture. So this lens has an aperture of f1.8, while this one here has an aperture of f1.2. The smaller the number is, the more light comes through that lens. The more light comes through your lens, the more blur background you will get at the end of the day. While this lens here costs only 100 euros compared to this one here for $2,500 or euros. This is a typical zoom lens that you can expect to get with a more expensive kit. For instance, if you purchase the Canon EOS 5D Mark IV, or if you buy a Nikon D810, you most of the time can buy it in a kit version as well with a 24 to 105 millimeter. So after you have seen all these type of lenses, I'm going to explain you why you need this lens, why you need this lens, why every lens is special for its own, and where is the price difference coming from. So let's start with the 18 to 135 millimeter lens. As I told you, you get this lens with a lot of kit versions out there in combination with an aps-c sensor camera. So this lens does not fit on a full frame camera like the Canon EOS 1DX or Canon EOS 5D Mark IV. If you have seen that lens from Nikon as well, it's not possible to attach it on a full frame camera like the Nikon D800 or D810, and it's also not possible to place that lens on top of a Sony camera. As you can see, here's the brand, which says Canon, and then it says EFS. EFS lenses, you can attach all EFS lenses on top of aps-c sensor cameras, but you can't attach them to full frame cameras, while you will be able to attach EF lenses to all Canon cameras. So this one says it's an 18 to 135 millimeter lens, and it's image stabilized. So what are these numbers standing for? As I told you at the beginning of this video, the more millimeters you have, the more zoom you have. Less millimeters means you get a wide angle. So 18 millimeters is already quite wide, while 135 millimeter is already zoomed in. If you're a spotter, that might be a good lens for you. So then there is the 1, and the most important thing is the number behind the 1. So as you can see, it says 3.5 to 5.6 IS/USM. That is the aperture. With the aperture, you can control how much light comes through that lens, and the smaller the number is, the faster or wider your aperture is as well. And that means the more blur background you get. But it means also the lens is more expensive than a lens with an aperture of f3.5 to 5.6. IS stands for image stabilizer and USM for ultrasonic motor. Every company has a different type of names for it. The aperture is always the same. It's written down usually as f. If you would like to protect your front element from any kind of scratches, make sure to read that number that says 67mm, and that's the filter thread. So here's the 70 to 200mm lens. I mean, the zoom range is almost the same, but it starts at 77mm and it goes to 200mm. Means you don't have any wide angle on here. So you already zoomed in quite a lot. This lens, compared to the other one that I was just showing you, costs more than 1,500 bucks. But where's the difference and why is that so expensive than the other one? Here on top is a distance indication. I don't know if you have tried it out one day. Sometimes your camera doesn't focus if you get too close to all your subjects, and that's because of the minimum focus distance. So you can get as close as 1.2 meters or 4 feet to your subject, otherwise the lens will not take a sharp photo, or it's not able to focus anymore because you're too close. At the side you can switch on the autofocus or revert back to manual focus, switch on the image stabilizer or turn it off. And as you can see, it says Canon zoom lens, EF. So that's an EF lens now, not an EFS lens. However, you can attach this lens to all Canon cameras. It doesn't matter if they have an aps-c sensor camera or if they are full frame. So EF lenses fit to every camera out there. It starts from 70mm and it goes to 200mm. So you can get further in instead of using the 135mm lens that I was just showing you. Unfortunately, you can't see the 2 anymore, but after the 1 it says double point, and then the aperture is f2.8. So from 70mm until 200mm you have a fixed aperture, means it doesn't matter how much you zoom in, you always get the same amount of light. While on this one, the more you zoom in here, the less light will come through because it has a variable aperture of f3.5 to 5.6. So once you zoom in here, you will lose some light. Otherwise, if you would have a lens that goes from 18 to 135mm with a fixed aperture of, let's say, 2.8, it would be probably that size, and it would probably cost more than 5,000 euro instead of 300 euros. Same as with the other lens, it's IS, so it has an image stabilizer. It's the second version of it. It has an ultrasonic motor. L stands for luxury. You can see it straight away because it has a red ring. And these lenses are made of high glass and they're most of the time really expensive. But if you earn your money with photography, or you really need a lens that allows you to take great photos which are really sharp, which allows you to take a blur background, go for these kind of lenses. However, they're really expensive, as I told you, but they are worth their price, and most of them are also weather sealed, like this one here. I know you like it, and so many people out there like it as well. Blur backgrounds, portrait pictures. Everyone loves these kind of photos where you take your model in front of a sunset and the entire background is just blurred out. Or you take a photo of a product and the background is also blurred out. That's also called bokeh. To get that bokeh, you need a lens with a fast aperture. As I told you, the aperture is always listed after the 1 double point. So this lens has an aperture of f1.8. STM stands for silent stepping motor. So this lens doesn't do any noise while you use the touch focus of your camera. Here it says Canon EF lens. So EF means you can use it on all cameras. It doesn't matter if they are full frame or aps-c. It's a fixed focal length. So that is not a zoom lens, it's only a 50mm. If you place that lens on top of a full frame camera, you have exactly 50mm. But once you place that lens on top of an aps-c sensor camera, you have to multiply the 50 times 1.6 to get the exact focal length. So 50 times 1.6 is 80 millimeters. And that was the crop factor I was talking about, which I'm going to show you still in a few moments. As you can see, you can guess what type of filters you require for this lens. But I can show you that straight away. It's 49 millimeter. So if you want to protect the front element from any kind of scratches, you need to buy a filter with a size of 49 millimeter. So here's something that you probably haven't seen before. That's the minimum focus distance. So once you're like 20 centimeters away from your subject, your camera won't be able to focus because the minimum focus distance is at 35 millimeter or 1.1 feet. Bear in mind, this lens cost about 100 bucks. So let's get to the heavy stuff. That's also a 50 millimeter lens. As you can see right here, it says 50 millimeter. So you also can't use that lens for zooming in. However, it's much bigger, it's much heavier than the other 50 millimeter I was just showing you for 100 bucks. Well, this lens cost about 2,500 bucks. At the side you have two switches. The first one I was explaining you before. That is to change from autofocus to manual focus. And on the lower side is a switch for the minimum focus distances. At the top it has a red ring. That means it's a luxury lens by Canon, so it's really expensive. But as you can see here on top it says Canon lens RF 50 millimeter f1.2 L USM. f1.2 is the aperture, L is luxury, USM is ultrasonic motor, and then it says RF 50 millimeter. That's a new mounting that was released by the end of 2018 by Canon. Nikon also did the same. They released a new mount called Z mount, and you can't use that lens on any DSLR. This lens only works in combination with the Canon EOS R or RP at the moment, and probably all the other mirrorless cameras in future by Canon. So remember, this lens costs 2,500 bucks, while this one here only 100 bucks. And as you can see, the difference here is so small. It has an aperture of f1.8, while the other lens has an aperture of f1.2. But what that means, I'm going to show you that once we're getting to the topic of blur backgrounds. So here, very quick, that's one of my favorite lenses for like the videos I'm doing. That's also a Canon lens. It says RF, so it's for the new mount. f1.8, that's the aperture. It's a macro lens. It has an image stabilizer, and it has also a silent stepping motor. But the most important feature about this lens is the minimum focus distance. As you can see here on the lens, it has a minimum focus distance of just 17 centimeters or 0.56 feet. That means you can get as close as 17 centimeters to your subject to focus, or 0.56 feet. So you can get really, really close to take great detail shots of food, animals, and all kind of products you need to take photos of. Last lens I would like to speak about is the 24 to 105 millimeter. So that's a zoom lens. But why is that lens with less focal length compared to this one here, 18 to 135 millimeter, remember, 300 euro, worth 1,000 euro. So where's the difference coming from? As you can see, it has a minimum focus distance indication. Okay, it has weather sealing. Okay, it has a red wing, means that's one of Canon's luxury models. But the devil is in the detail. As you can see, you need a 77 millimeter filter for this lens if you would like to protect it. It's a Canon zoom lens. EF means you can use it on full frame cameras and aps-c sensor cameras, and you can zoom with it from 24 to 105 millimeter. Means you have a wide angle lens, a normal lens, And you also have already a telephoto lens. And as you can see here at the back side, it has a fixed aperture. It says 4. So it doesn't matter how much you zoom in. It's always the same amount of light that comes through this lens compared to this one, where you will lose some light while you zoom in. L, as I told you, that's the luxury version. Then it says IS, that's image stabilizer. 2, because it's already the second version of this lens. USM ultrasonic motor. So if you have a full frame camera and you need a good lens for travel photography, that's one of the lenses I can recommend. At the moment it's probably kind of hard to follow because you haven't seen any examples yet. But trust me, first of all, we need to talk about the basics, and later on I give you all the examples you need to take proper photos. So while we spoke about cameras, the difference in price range, the difference between an aps-c sensor and a full frame camera, and also various types of lenses, let's speak about the 3 essentials of photography: the shutter speed, the ISO and the aperture. The aperture depends only on the lens. This lens for $1,500 has a fixed aperture of f2.8. To have a rough idea what the aperture does, it controls the amount of light that comes through the lens on your camera sensor. An aperture of f1.0 or f1.2 that we have seen on the big Canon lens on the 50mm to approximately f2.8, 3.5, you can consider it as a fast aperture. So a lot of light comes through that lens. Everything from f3.5 and above, you can consider it as a slow aperture. Why do you require a fast aperture? At night, because more light comes through the lens. For a blur background, because the smaller the number is, the more blurry the background will get. And of course, if you are using fast shutter speeds on low ISO values, you also require a lens with a fast aperture. But we speak about that when we come to sport photography. It doesn't matter if you take a photo with this lens at 70mm or 100mm or 200mm. There's always the same amount of light coming through this lens. That doesn't mean that you can't change the aperture. You can't go below f2.8, f stands for aperture. But you can turn it down so the number goes up, let's say f4. You can choose an aperture of f4 to get rid of some light and to lose also the blur background, but you can't go below 2.8. So you can't make an aperture of f1.2 using this lens because that depends on the lens. And as I said, that's a 70 to 200mm lens, f2.8. This lens is also available with an aperture of f4, so less light, but more than $500 less price. To summarize, with the aperture you are controlling the amount of light that comes through the lens onto your camera sensor. The smaller the number is, the more blur the background will get, the more you can isolate your subjects from the fore or the background, and it's more favorable for taking photos at night, for taking videos, because everyone out there loves blur backgrounds. If you would like to take a landscape photo, you can do that easily with an aperture of f5.6 or f8. So the higher the number is, the less light comes through your lens, the less expensive most of the lenses are, and the sharper the image will get. Because you can take a photo at f1.2, so you can isolate either the fore or the background and focus exactly on one spot, but this spot will not be as sharp as the same photo taken with an aperture of f4, for instance. So close down the aperture and you will get more sharpness onto your entire photo. It doesn't make any sense to buy a 50mm lens with an aperture of f.2 for landscape photography, because most of the time you would like to have a lot of things in frame, like a mountain or a lake, where you require a wide angle lens. And you don't need to isolate the fore or backgrounds in that photo. That means you can easily take this photo with an aperture of f5.6, f4 or f8. And this also depends on the ambient light which is out there at the moment. So if the sun is shining, if you're taking this photo at night, if you're taking this photos at daytime, when it's foggy, when it's cloudy. And let's assume you would like to take a photo of a lake during the night. Make sure to use a tripod, use the aperture you need, like f4, and do a longer exposure time, not to push the ISO too far. Next topic we need to speak about is the shutter speed. The shutter speed is like the clack that you hear once you take a photo. So I give you now an example straight away. So that's a shutter speed of 1/300th of a second. So that's a shutter speed of an 8,000th of a second. Let's take a shutter speed of a 20th of a second. And now let's take a shutter speed of 1 second. Did you notice the difference? Once I take a photo at a shutter speed of 1 second, the mirror pops up, you see the sensor for 1 second, and the camera will expose the scene that you have at this moment for 1 second. You can imagine once you're out there and the sun is shining and you would expose the scene for 1 second, the entire image will be overexposed because you have enough ambient light available. Let's assume it's nighttime and you're exactly at the same spot where you were while the sun was shining, and now you take a photo using a shutter speed of 1 second. You might be able to see something because you exposed that image or that scene for longer than during the daytime. So I can tell you straight away, if you take this photo with the settings you have on the camera and you do an exposure during the daytime of 1 second, the entire image will be overexposed. Most of the time you see only white. So the more ambient light you have available, let's assume you're at daytime and you're in front of a really huge mountain, the less exposure you need. If you're exactly at the same spot and it's nighttime, the longer your exposure needs to be to get in that the same amount of light as during the daytime. Another easy example for you. If you're in a stadium and you would like to take a photo of a football player and you would take an exposure time of 1 second, while the football player is just running like crazy, he's already gone after 1 second. You know, you can't freeze that moment with an exposure time of 1 second. Since the football player is running, you want to freeze exactly that scene. You would like to see some emotion, you would like to see that guy running. So what you need is a fast shutter speed. For instance, this camera allows you to go down to a shutter speed of an 8,000th of a second. That is like that. And to use a high burst rate as well. So if it's daytime in that stadium and you would like to take a photo of that football player, you need a fast shutter speed. For instance, like 1600, 2000 of a second or 2500 of a second. So that's 2500 of a second. To freeze that moment. It's all about to freeze that moment. If you are taking a photo at night of a mountain, so a landscape photo, and there's only the moon shining, or let's say it's cloudy, you need to expose longer to get the same amount of light onto your camera sensor, which has been there during the daytime. To make it simple, fast shutter speeds for sport photography, long shutter speeds for night photography. But we'll get to these points later on, so it will become clear for you, I promise. Last but not least important is the ISO. What does ISO do? The ISO compensates any missing light you have. For instance, if you are out there and you would like to take a photo of a landscape, of like a forest, a tree, and the sun is shining, do you have enough ambient light available or not? The answer is yes, you do. Do you need to compensate any light in this situation? No, because you have enough ambient light available. That means use a small ISO value. If you're at night and you're in a stadium and there's not enough ambient light available, you don't have a lens with a fast aperture and you need to use a fast shutter speed, you need to compensate some light because you would like to take a photo of your son who's just running by and you would like to freeze this moment. Therefore, you would require a fast shutter speed. But unfortunately, you only have the kit lens 18 to 135 millimeter. You zoomed in to 135 millimeters. That means you only have an aperture of f5.6. So you need to take now a fast shutter speed, so only clack. You don't have a lens for $1,500 with you, so you need to compensate a lot of light because you need to take a fast shutter speed to freeze this moment. You don't have a really expensive lens, and the only component you can change now is the ISO. So you need to take a higher ISO value of, let's say, 3200 or 6400. But as you can see on the final image, it looks a bit grainy. And this means you use a higher ISO value. So the more ambient light you have, the less ISO you need. The less light you have, the more light you need to compensate. Either you do this with a lens that has a fast aperture, which are expensive, or you take a longer exposure time, which is not always possible since you have fast moving subjects, or you don't have any tripod available, or you push the ISO. So the higher the ISO value is, the more grainy your photo gets, but in fact you compensate for any missing light. The more light you have available, the less ISO you require because you have already a lot of ambient light. I try to explain it as simple as possible. If I would be you, I probably wouldn't have understood a lot by this time. So let's get to some examples after we spoke about all the important essentials: aperture, shutter speed and ISO. So by the way, here is a good example of the aperture and of what it's doing. I'm using at the moment the 50mm f1.8. So that's the widest aperture we have, that's f1.8. Let me close that down for you. So that's an aperture of f2.8. And as you can see, less light come through. So that's an aperture of f4, f5.6, and I can go all the way down to f8. As you can see, the hole is getting smaller and the less light come through, and to a maximum of f22. As you can see, the hole is so tiny now. And what would you expect now? Is a lot of light coming through or not? Obviously not. So this is f22, and I open it again, more light will come through. And that's an aperture of f1.8, so that's the fastest one I can use at the moment. So more blur background, less sharp. I close it down, let's say f4, less light, more sharp, less blur background. That's an aperture of f5, so even less light, sharper photo, less blur background. Let's take an aperture of f10. As you can see, even less light is coming through. So you need to compensate this light, if it's not bright enough out there, with either a shutter speed that is like a 25 0.5 or 1 second or something like that, or with a higher ISO value. One thing you need to remember is, for most lenses out there, the smaller the aperture is, the more expensive the lens is as well. Why do you actually need a tripod? Either you have a really heavy camera or a lens, you do like interviews and stuff, you would like to have some stable footage, or you do long time exposures. So here's a really tiny tripod that I use most of the time for reviews. Here is a flexible one, which is nice if you don't have enough space available, if you would like to place that on an uneven surface. And that's also nice for doing video blogs as well. And this one here is my big tripod that I use most of the time for like taking photos at night. If I would like to have a scene, a city, you know, where I require a longer exposure time, where I don't want to push the ISO too far, and where I would like to have everything in frame, so using an aperture of f5.6 or f8, I need a tripod to compensate for the longer exposure time and the missing ambient light. So that's the one here. I will put all my gear in the video description below, so you can choose what you require for the type of photography you're doing. I'm here in Frankfurt at the skate park near the European Central Bank to explain you the crop factor once again I was talking about previously in that video. So on a Canon camera you have a crop factor of 1.6, whereas on Nikon and Sony you have a crop factor of 1.5. That means a full frame sensor on a Canon camera is 1.6 times bigger than your aps-c sensor of an aps-c sensor camera. With Nikon and Sony it's 1.5 times bigger. If you're using a 50mm lens on an aps-c sensor camera, you have to multiply it by 1.6 with Canon. Then you get 80mm equivalent compared to a full frame camera. And now I would like to show you the difference. I'm here, as I told you, there are tons of videos on YouTube where people explain what a crop factor really is. I'm here now at the Main River with a full frame camera and with an aps-c sensor camera. I use my tripod and it's stationary, so I'm not moving at all. I'm using a 24mm lens, so it's not a zoom lens, it only has 24mm, so it is a wide angle lens on a full frame camera at the moment because I'm using the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II. And now I'm going to take a photo of the European Central Bank with the skyline in the background, and let's see how it looks like. So as you can see, here's my Canon EOS 1DX. These are my settings. I use an aperture of f8, ISO 100 because we have enough ambient light available, and a shutter speed of 1/160 of a second. If I go into live view, it looks like this on a full frame camera. And let's take a photo now. And here is the photo. As you can see, I'm stationary, so I'm not moving at all with this full frame camera. As you can see, it's a Canon lens. It's 24mm, so it's not a zoom lens because there's no minus in between. It has an aperture of f1.4, and I'm using now the exact same lens on an aps-c sensor camera, and we will compare both images to see what the difference is between a full frame image and an aps-c image. So here's the Canon EOS 7070. As you can see, I'm using exactly the same lens, the Canon EF 24mm, so no zoom lens. So let's take a photo. As you can see, it's exactly the same settings as before. Let's take a photo. And as you can see, that's exactly the same spot as before, but we took the same photo using an aps-c sensor camera. So you have to multiply the focal length, which is 24mm, times 1.6 to figure out the focal length compared to a full frame camera. So to make it easy, 24 times 1.6 gives you a focal length compared to a full frame camera of 38.4 millimeters. That's important when you buy a lens. So if you would like to shoot interior and architecture photography, you would like to get a lot of things onto your photo because you don't have enough space available. That's a good decision to buy a wide angle lens. For instance, a 24mm lens, a 15mm lens. And if you use this lens now on an aps-c sensor camera, you don't have a 10mm lens anymore because you have to multiply it by 1.6 with Canon or 1.5 with Nikon or Sony. So you have already a 16mm lens. So the field of view shrinks. So after discussing all the basics, we start straight away with landscape photography. Then you can ask yourself, what matters for landscape photography? Do we need a fast aperture, so a small number? Maybe from a lens that cost over $2,000? No, we don't, because we don't need any blur background. For landscape photography, everything has to be sharp, from the center to the corner. So we don't need a fast aperture. Next point is, do you need to be really close to all the subjects? Probably not, because you most of the time would like to have a lot of things on your photo. That means you don't need a telephoto lens. That means you don't need a portrait lens. That means you need a wide angle lens. So the focal length is really small. For instance, a 10mm lens or the 10 to 18mm lens, a 24mm lens, and you can also buy a fisheye lens, maybe an 8 to 15mm lens. So that means it looks like one of these GoPro movies with these round shaped edges. In the background, I'm using now the Canon EOS 7070 with the 24mm lens, which is on this camera not a wide angle lens because you have to multiply it by 1.6, the crop factor. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm gonna leave this lens on this camera. So it's daytime, we do have enough ambient light available. Now let's discuss the 3 points: the shutter speed, the ISO and the aperture you're gonna need. First of all, when you have enough ambient light available, do you need to push the ISO high or low? The answer is you can turn down the ISO as much as possible. That's always the aim, to keep the ISO as low as possible to avoid grainy images and to enhance the final image quality. So I think ISO 100 is a really good value to start with. Then you have 2 more settings to think of. Next, the aperture. Do I need a blur background? Probably not, because we don't want to take a portrait photo with a blurry background. We would like to take a landscape photo. So everything has to be sharp. Now you can think of, I told you previously in this video, a small number, so f1.2, f2.8, you will get a blur background, but less sharp images. So go up with the number and close the aperture. I can tell you straight away a good value to start with when it's daytime, when you would like to take landscape photos, and if you have enough ambient light available. And a really good value to start with is f8, because we do have enough ambient light available because it's daytime. We would like to have a sharp image. That means the higher the number is, the sharper the final image will get. And as you can see on your lens, most of the lenses have even a faster aperture of f8. For instance, the 10 to 18mm lens, I think it has an aperture of f4 to 5.6. And there's also this 24mm lens behind me, which has an aperture of f1.4. So you can get a blur background, but that doesn't really matter in this case because we would like to have a sharp photo. So I'm using now an aperture of f8. And the last point is the shutter speed. Do I need to expose the image long? No, because we do have enough ambient light available. So in this case, no one is running because we are stationary. We have chosen that we use a low ISO value. We start with an aperture of f8 because it's daytime. We would like to have everything sharp on our final photo. And the last point we have to think about is now the shutter speed. What is the correct value? A long time exposure doesn't make any sense. If you use a 4000 of a shutter speed, it's probably not well exposed because it might be still too dark. So it has to be something in between. So we can start maybe with 250 or 500 of a second. So here's the ISO, it says ISO 100. Here is my aperture, f8. It doesn't say f on here, but it does on your display of the camera. See, it says f8. And let's try out a shutter speed maybe of a 250 of a second, and let's see what's going to happen. So I think that photo is not looking too bad, but as you can see, you have a line here on this camera, and you have that line on almost every camera. It might be on a different position, but most cameras out there do have this line. That means you're in the upper region, so in the plus region. So your camera tells you straight away that your image will be overexposed. What we can do is we can use a faster shutter speed, so a higher number of here. So that's a 400 of a second, and that's a 500 of a second, and that's a 640 of a second. So less exposure time for the camera. And as you can see, now I brought this line exactly to 0. And let's see what's going to happen if I take a photo now. So this one here looks kind of underexposed. As you can see, the water is well exposed, but you have really dark edges here, like the bridge, the pier, and on the left side the buildings are really well underexposed. But we're getting there. So let's take a longer exposure time maybe to do maybe a little bit of overexposure, but to get back the shadows here. As you can see, this photo looks much better because you have now the details at the bridge. You can see the pier and the buildings are coming back as well. Now I will give you another example. So I leave everything like it is, still the same ISO of 100. I leave exactly the shutter speed as it is, 1/320 of a second. And I open now the aperture, so more light is coming through the lens. And let's see, the fastest aperture on this lens is f1.4, as seen on this lens as well. And I can tell you straight away now more light is coming through, and let's guess what's going to happen. The ISO is as low as it can be, the shutter speed is still the same as before, but we opened the aperture. So more light is passing through this lens now because we're using now the widest or the fastest aperture of this lens, which is f1.4. Let's see what's going to happen if I take a photo now. It's well overexposed because more light is passing through the lens. So ask yourself, is it logic now to take a fast aperture of f1.4? No, it's not, because we don't need to have any blur background. And I told you before, the lower this number is, the aperture, the less sharp your final image will be. And since we would like to have a landscape photo, which should be sharp from the center to the corner and vice versa, we need to close down the aperture. Let's try an aperture of f5.6. and let's see what's going to happen. Remember, if you close down the aperture, less light is coming through, but the more sharp your final photo will be. As you can see, that's much better than the previous photo, but it's still a bit overexposed. But at f5.6, the photo is already quite sharp. So let's try something out. We would like to get the same photo which was correctly exposed, but using a different aperture, 1/800 of a second. So what the camera does now, it will expose the image less than before. And here it is, it's the same photo, it's correctly exposed. So what did we do? We used a faster aperture, so more light was coming through, and we had to compensate that incoming light with a faster shutter speed. So I switched the cameras, and now I would like to show you what's going to happen if I use the 24mm lens, which is on this camera now, with a full frame camera. So let's take a photo now and let's use the values as before, ISO 100, aperture f8, and the shutter speed 1/320 of a second. So here's the photo. As you can see, we have much more things in frame. Now you can see this big building here, which is the European Central Bank. And let's see what's going to happen if I use a higher ISO value. So maybe ISO 1600. As you see, we still use the same settings, a 320 of a second, f8, but now we use a much higher ISO value. That means we are compensating light, which we don't have to compensate because we do have enough ambient light available. So just for this demonstration, I'm going to take a photo now. And as you can see, it's well overexposed. Why? Because we push the ISO high, so the camera thinks, well, it's too dark, so I need to use a higher ISO value, but it is bright enough, so we don't need to push the ISO. So there are now 3 ways to expose the image still correctly. Either you go down with the ISO again and use a lower ISO value, or use a different shutter speed. So that's what I'm trying to do now, maybe 1,000 of a second, and I think it's still too bright, but let's see. See, it's still too bright, so we're exposing less. Let's take a 2,000 of a second. So the camera now will only expose for a 2,000 of a second. As you can see, it's looking better. Let's take a shutter speed of a 3,000 of a second. Still the same aperture, still the same ISO, but we're exposing less long. Well, and that's basically the photo we took at the beginning with an aperture of f8, but now we're using a faster shutter speed. So we're exposing less long. And what I'm trying to tell you is you can get to the same result using different values. But make sure, ISO, the higher the ISO value is, the more grainy your final image will get. But remember, doesn't make sense to push the ISO in this kind of scenario. No, it doesn't, because we do have enough ambient light available. What does ISO do? It will compensate missing light. But as I told you, enough ambient light available. What does ISO do as well? It will make your final image grainy, and you don't want to have grainy images, so the image quality is reduced. So always try to go down with the ISO as much as you can. f8, as I told you, we would like to have a sharp image from the center to the corner, so f8 is a really good value to start with, and when the sun is shining, always use f8 and you will have a sharp image from the center to the corner. What I can do now for the purpose of this demonstration, I will turn down the ISO and I will take the same picture with ISO 100, f8, and we're still using the same shutter speed of 3,200 of a second. And what do you think is going to happen now? Will the photo be overexposed or underexposed? Let's see what's going to happen. It's underexposed. Why? Because we don't let a lot of light passing through the camera lens, because we're still using aperture of f8, so we're closing down the aperture. Now the ISO is pretty low, and that's now the fault of the shutter speed, because the shutter speed is not long enough. Let's take another shutter speed, maybe 1/500 of a second. As you can see, this image is still a bit too dark because the sun is not here at the moment. So let's take a 320 of a second. And there is exactly the same photo as before. So there are many ways to expose correctly. But remember, always use low ISO values because it will not improve the image quality if you push it too high. f8, a really good value to start with while taking landscape photography. And the only thing that you now have to look at is the shutter speed. So next topic I would like to speak about very quick is macro photography, because that depends also on the lens you're using. And as I told you at the beginning of this review, if you would like to take great detail shots, it's favorable to have a macro lens. So a lens that allows you to go very close to all your subjects. In this case, I'm using the Canon EOS R with a really cheap macro lens, which is the 35mm RF lens. It has an aperture of f1.8, so it lets a lot of light in, so you are able to isolate the fore from the background and vice versa, and you can get pretty close to your subject. And as I told you at the beginning of this video, you see the minimum focus distances on the lens itself. So this lens has a minimum focus distance of 17 centimeters or 0.56 feet from the sensor. Not the front element to the subject, from the sensor to the subject. So that's now really basic. I do have a little flower here, and sometimes there are some bees in it as well, as you can see on this one. And the question I'm asking now myself, do I would like to have a blur background or not? If yes, what's the first thing you need to do is to open the aperture. So use a small f number. With this lens I can use its widest aperture, which is f1.8. So I can let a lot of light passing through the lens. If I would do that, I can isolate the fore from the background and vice versa. If I do that, what's going to happen with the ISO? I mean, it's daytime, I do have enough ambient light available. If you use a higher ISO value, you will lose some image quality because your image gets grainy. So, enough ambient light available, and I open the aperture, so that means a lot of light is passing through the lens already, so use a small ISO value, maybe ISO 100. And that's exactly what I will do in this case, so I use ISO 100. And the last point again is to think about the shutter speed. These flowers are moving because here's some wind. So, and if I would do a long exposure time, maybe a second, will the final image be overexposed or underexposed? The answer is it will be overexposed, since the flowers are moving, so you don't have sharp images, and I want to freeze that moment because they are moving, so I have to use a really fast shutter speed. In this case I can start, I mean on the mirrorless cameras it's pretty easy because you can already see how your final image will look like, but let's try maybe a 2500 of a second, because enough ambient light available, we have a lens with a fast aperture, and let's see what's going to happen if I use a shutter speed of a 2500 of a second, because it's moving, everything is under motion here. And let's take this flower here for instance. As you can see, the image is pretty dark. What you can do to compensate that is use a longer exposure time, maybe 1000 of a second, and let's see what's going to happen. So I expose now a little bit longer. As you can see, this photo looks much better compared to the photo that we took before, and still we have some wind here, so it's moving, so you can't use a long exposure time, otherwise the photo will not be sharp, because you would like to freeze that moment. But we can still use a bit of ISO or use a longer exposure time, maybe an 800 of a second, because then the image will still be sharp enough. Let's see. And I think this photo looks pretty good. So if I would like to see some more of the background, what do you think you need to do? Correct, you close down the aperture, so the number, the f value gets higher, so we're closing the aperture, so less light is passing through, but the entire image gets more sharp. So what I'm trying to do now is to take exactly the same photo, but now this time we're using an aperture of f4. So what's going to happen? The aperture closes, so less light is passing through. And if I would use the exact same values I was using to take the photo with an aperture of f1.8, you will see the difference in a few seconds. And guess what? Will it be over or underexposed? Correct. The final image will be underexposed. And why? Because we were stealing some light, because we're closing the aperture, and still we're using the same values. And as you can see, we still have some wind here, so all these bushes are under motion. So what we need to do is to use a fast shutter speed anyways, and maybe a 500 of a second will work out as well. And let's see what's going to happen. So now I'm using a 500 of a second f4, aperture of f4, and still the same ISO value of 100. And let's see what's going to happen. It's still pretty dark, but I don't want to use a really long exposure time because otherwise the final image will not be sharp anymore because everything is here under motion. So what you need to do now is to compensate the missing light is correct. You need to go up with the ISO a little bit. Let's try ISO 320. Or on some cameras, on the cheaper ones, you only have 100, 200 and 400. You can use 400 as well. Let's use ISO 400 and let's see what's going to happen. As you can see, this photo looks well exposed with more background compared to the photo we were previously taken at an aperture of f1.8. So the difference here is that one photo was taken with an aperture of f1.8, the other one was taken with an aperture of f4. With the photo taken at f4, the entire image tends to look a bit more sharp, while the ones taken at an aperture of f1.8, you isolated the 4 from the background, so it was less sharp. Last thing we would like to do is to use now an aperture of f8, so we're stealing the camera a lot of light because the aperture gets smaller while the value is getting higher, so the number f8 is going up, so we're stealing a lot of light. And let's take exactly the same settings as before, a 500 of a second and ISO 400. And this photo is well underexposed. However, the brushes are still under motion because here's some wind. So I can't use a longer exposure time, otherwise the image might not be sharp because we need to freeze that moment. However, we are now restricted with the aperture. Let's assume you have a lens with its vastest aperture of f8, so you can't use a lower value. So the last thing you can adjust is to take a higher ISO value. Let's take an ISO, so this camera features ISO 2500. So let's take that photo, f8, ISO 2500, and now a 500 of a second. As you can see on this photo, you have now a lot of things in the background. So you see all these leaves, the details of these leaves. You still have that flower in the foreground, but you don't get the same amount of bokeh that you got before while using an aperture of f1.8. However, you had to compensate the missing light because you were closing the aperture. You had to take a fast shutter speed, otherwise the final image would not have been sharp. So you had to push the ISO to 2500. So you decreased, in fact, the image quality. Last example, I turn now down the ISO back to 200. I still use an aperture of f8. And because I would like to demonstrate what's going to happen if you use a longer exposure time, maybe a 30 of a second, while the brushes here are in motion because of the wind. As you can see now, the photo is well exposed, but since we have some wind here, it's not sharp because everything here was in motion. Same as with football players. If you would like to take a photo of a football player who is running, if you use a long exposure time, he's gone by the time you took the photo. So you have to use a fast shutter speed to freeze the moment. Same photo, different scenarios, different settings, and now you can choose what you need. Do you need a blur background? Then buy a lens with a fast aperture. Is your subject in motion? Then use a slow shutter speed. Do you have enough ambient light available? Then use a low ISO value. So now it's time to take some great portrait pictures. When you think about portrait pictures, the first thing that should come into your mind is the aperture. So that depends mainly on the lens you're using. If you use a lens now with a fast aperture, you get a lot of blur background. That means the number has to be small. And most of the lenses that have a fast aperture, they are quite expensive, but there are also some versions that are quite affordable, like the 50mm f1.8 by Sony, by Nikon, and of course by Canon, round about 100 to 150 bucks. Here's Julia, and she's going to help me out today because I will take some portrait pictures of her and I will let you know what's important doing so. Here are all the lenses that we're going to use for this portrait shooting. First of all, we're going to use the standard version of the EOS 77D, which is the 18 to 135mm. To see if it's possible to get a nice blur background, then we're going to use this one here, the 50mm f1.8 for about 100 bucks by Canon. That's also another Canon lens that's mainly used for sport and press photographers. That's the 70 to 200mm lens. So it's a telephoto lens. This lens here is probably the most expensive one out of these. It's around about 2,500 bucks. It has a fast aperture of f1.2, so it lets a lot of light in, and it's made for the Canon EOS R. So it's an RF lens which doesn't fit onto a DSLR. For example, that's the 77D, and this lens does not fit onto this camera since it does have a different mounting. But we compare all of these four lenses together and let's see what's gonna happen. So this one here has an aperture of f1.8. It lets a lot of light in, as you can see. And as I told you previously, all the lenses which have an aperture of f1.2 to approximately 3.5 are pretty good for doing portrait pictures, since they let a lot of light in and you will get this nice blurred background. This lens here is the 18 to 135mm, and as you can see from its aperture, it has only an aperture of f3.5 to 5.6. So you can't expect to have such a great blur background as using the other lenses. The 70 to 200mm is one of the best lenses for taking portrait pictures. It's also pretty nice for wedding photography, since you can get really close to all the people without disturbing them. And as you can see, it does have an aperture of f2.8, which is pretty good to get a blur background. And since it's a telephoto lens, you also have this nice blur background anyways. While this lens here is probably one of the best lenses for taking portrait pictures, the 50mm, and this one here has an aperture of f1.2. So as you can see straight away from the front element, it lets a lot of light in. So let's start with the EOS 77D. I'm using now the 18 to 135mm. So you do have a wide angle lens, and it does feature a telephoto lens as well, since you can zoom into 135mm. I can tell you straight away, once shooting at 80mm, you don't have the same effect as shooting like at 50, 70 or 135mm. If you zoom in now, the field of view is decreasing, and that's better for taking portraits because you isolate the fore from the background, and the focus is mainly set on your subject instead of the background, which may disturb the entire image. So, and since this lens has a variable aperture, that means the more you zoom in, the less light is passing through the lens, and the maximum aperture, so the smallest number that we can get at 135mm, is f5.6. So it's not ideal for taking portrait pictures. However, I'm going to demonstrate what's going to happen if we take portrait pictures with this lens. The sun is shining. We're here at the European Central Bank in the background at the Main River. We have enough ambient light available. The first thing you need to think of while taking a portrait picture, you would like to isolate the fore from the background. So I would like to have Julia in focus and less background, because I want to have her in focus. That means the first thing you should think about is open the aperture. So use a fast aperture to isolate the fore from the background. Always think about fast aperture while shooting portraits. So, and the widest aperture, as I told you on this lens, is f5.6. So there's not much light passing through this lens. Second thing you need to think of is the ISO setting. We're here, the sun is shining, sometimes you have some clouds passing by, but however we do have enough ambient light available. Do you need high ISO or low ISO? I'm pretty sure you know it. You don't need to push the ISO high. You can take ISO 100 and that is perfect for this kind of situation since we're in daylight, and there's no reason to boost the ISO high since it will decrease your final image quality. So f5.6, ISO 100, and the last thing you have to think about is the shutter speed. Does it make any sense to take a photo now at a shutter speed of 1 second? No, because then your final image will be overexposed. Since the mirror pops up, it will take all the ambient light which is here available onto your sensor and your entire image would be overexposed. You can try it out. I think here we probably need like a shutter speed of a 500th of a second or 800th of a second or maybe 1,000th of a second. And let's try it out by taking a shutter speed of 640th of a second and let's see what's gonna happen. First of all, I'm gonna make a test photo to see if I'm exposing correctly. So Julia, come on here. As you can see, a 640th of a second was a pretty good guess. So I will step now a little bit backwards because at 135 millimeters, you have to multiply it by 1.6. That's the crop factor. I'm already too close to her face. So I just have her face in focus. And so I need to go a bit further away. And maybe I will use also a different shutter speed, maybe an 800th of a second, but 640 was quite good. And that has also something to do with experience. Since I already took tons of portrait pictures, I can already guess what kind of shutter speed I need in what kind of scenario. But if you don't try it out by yourself, you will never find it out. As you can see, I was pretty close with 135 millimeter. So I will zoom out a little bit to 85 millimeter since I have it here on the scale, which is pretty nice. And let me see if I can take a different aperture. No, I'm still restricted by the lens itself. So I can take now an aperture of 5.6 anyways, but I will have a bit more in frame than just her face. Komm jetzt mal ein bisschen closer. So as you can see from these kind of examples, if you have the sun and she is pointing her face away from the sun, you do have some pretty dark edges, which are the shadows. To avoid this, you either take a guy or a girl who is going to use a reflector to compensate these shadows by using all the available light, or you take these kind of photos in a shadow area. But what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna switch to the 50 millimeter lens, f1.8, so we're using a wider aperture, which gives you some more available light that's passing through the lens, which gives you even a more blurred background. So here is the 50 millimeter lens. As you can see, this entire package is quite small. It's super light, and that's why I like this lens. I owned this lens by myself. I will also put a link in the video description below, so you can buy it on Amazon. It's a pretty good deal, 100 bucks, an aperture of f1.8, which is pretty cool. And I'm using now the widest aperture, f1.8. That means with the settings that we were using before, ISO 100, because we do have enough ambient light here, so we don't need to push the ISO. And now we opened the aperture, so more light is passing through that lens. The background will get more blurry, so you can isolate Julia from the background even more. The entire image gets less sharp since we're opening the aperture. And now the last component you have to think of is the shutter speed. So we were exposing the image correctly by using a shutter speed of an 800, 640 or 1,000 of a second. And what's going to happen if I use the same setting as before? I'm going to take now a photo just to demonstrate what is going to happen. At ISO 100, aperture f1.8, and the same settings as before, a 640 of a second and an 800 of a second, to give you a rough idea what's going to happen if I would use the same settings as before. So that's a 640 of a second. And that's now an 800 of a second. I go a bit closer. As you can see from these examples, they are well overexposed since we do have enough ambient light available. I mean, we're taking now photos in the bright daylight the sun is shining. So what you need to do is, you can't go down with the ISO since already it's the lowest value I can take on this camera. The aperture is open, so there's the maximum light which would pass through that lens is passing through this lens. So you have to use a faster shutter speed. And I think a 2000 or even a 2500 of a second will do it. So let's try out and see what's going to happen. So a 2000 of a second is still too much. Let's try a 4000 of a second. And by the way, that's sometimes the fastest shutter speed you can use on cheaper cameras. So that's the difference. That's also kind of a difference if you buy a camera for 6,000 euros, since it has a shutter speed of an 8000 of a second, and I think the maximum here is a 4000 of a second. So as you can see, this photo is still a bit overexposed. I can't do more than using the lowest ISO value. I can't use a faster shutter speed. So the only thing that you can do is to expose now correctly is to close the aperture. If I would use a different camera like the EOS one, the X Mark II, I would have been able to use a shutter speed of an 8000 of a second or 6400 of a second, but in this case I can't. So I need to close the aperture, so we're closing it so less light is coming through. The background will get a bit sharper, but you're putting away some ambient light and therefore you will expose correctly. So the setting now is an aperture of f2.2, ISO 100 and a shutter speed of a 4000 of a second. And let's see how this looks like. So now there are some clouds coming by, and that might be your chance to use the aperture of f1.8, to use the ISO of 100 and to make use of the fastest shutter speed of a 4000 of a second to expose correctly. Let's try it out one more time, since we have now less light available, since we do have some clouds covering the sun. And let's see how that looks like. So aperture f1.8, ISO 100 and a 4000 of a second. That's cool, yeah, very good. As you can see from these images, they are well exposed. We do have our maximum blur background as we can get from this lens. We have less light available since we do have some clouds covering the sun. So we're going now into the shadows over there to give you another examples while taking portrait pictures. So now it's time to use the telephoto lens. I do have here now the EOS 77D, which has a small sensor, so it does feature an aps-c sensor, but I can use also the bigger lenses, which is in this case the 70 to 200 millimeter. It does have an aperture, so the widest aperture through the entire focal length, so it doesn't matter if you're at 70 millimeter or if you take a photo at 200 millimeters, the aperture is the same throughout the entire focal length. However, you can still close it to make it f4, to make it f5.6 or to make it f8, f aperture. But that's why this lens is more expensive than the one I showed you before, the 18 to 135 millimeter, since it does have a fixed aperture. So it doesn't matter how much you zoom in, it always lets the same amount of light passing through the lens. And since we're now taking a portrait picture, we need a fast aperture, so to get that blur background that everyone loves while taking portrait pictures. I'm using now an aperture of f2.8. We're now in the shadows, so the sun is shining, but we are not exposed by directly sunlight. So I can still use ISO 100 since we do have enough ambient light available. However, it's shadow, but it's daytime. And the only thing we have to think about now is the shutter speed. I'm gonna try it out to use a 200 of a second, and I'll let you know if it fits or not. You have to try it out sometimes, but that's basically the only component you have to think about, because you know that you would like to have a fast aperture since you would like to have a blur background. It's daytime, ISO 100, perfect. And last component is only the shutter speed you have to think about. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm gonna go over there and I'm gonna take a photo from there, shooting her from behind. I'm just gonna test it out, the settings, if it works or not. As you can see, this was still a bit too dark, since a 200 of a second was not sufficient to cover the missing light. I can tell her to stand still, and therefore I would be able to take the same photo with a shutter speed of a 100 of a second, or I leave it at 200 of a second to get a sharp image, because we would like to freeze exactly the moment. So what I can do now, I can use ISO 200. And if that is not sufficient, I can still use a shutter speed of maybe 160 of a second or 100 of a second. But first of all, let's try the following. Wide aperture, f2.8, ISO now up, ISO 200, which will still give you kind of the same image quality as ISO 100. And we are still using the same shutter speed of a 200 of a second. And if this doesn't help out, we're gonna use a longer exposure time, since I can tell her to stand still, and then the problem is solved. Kurz gucken. Yeah, a 200 of a second is working perfectly with the aperture of f2.8, ISO 200, and as you can see, you can still go a bit further to the background to get her in frame, and I probably have to go like 30 feet away so that she's completely in focus with her entire body. And she knows how to pose. That's also pretty cool. That makes your work a bit easier. What I would like to show you now is what's gonna happen if I close the aperture. So we are getting less light through the lens, but the entire image is getting sharper. Also, you will get more background. So what I'm going to do now is I will use an aperture of f4, since you can buy this lens also with an aperture of f4 through the entire focal length, which is less expensive and probably more affordable for the rest of the world if you would like to have such a lens. So I'm using now an aperture of f4. That means we're closing the aperture, less light is passing through, the entire image gets more sharp, but you have to compensate the missing light either with more ISO, so maybe we take ISO 400, or we use a longer shutter speed. In this case, I'm going to try it out with the shutter speed, and I think an 80 of a second or a 100 of a second will be sufficient, and we still would take great pictures which are sharp. Ja, das ist schön. Ja, gehen wir durch die Haare. Kurz gucken. Ja, ist cool, passt. As you can see, this I had a good guess on here. I'm using now a 100 of a second, aperture f4 and ISO 200. We still have some blur background. The more you zoom in and the more you focus on her face, the more blur background you will get. And the more you zoom out, the more background you will have. And the less you isolate the fore from the background, in this case, Julia. So now I go a bit closer to her. I will go now down to 70 millimeter, still the same aperture f4, to get a close-up of her face and maybe some detail shots while she's wearing her glasses. So that was the 70 to 200 millimeter, a pretty cool lens for taking portrait pictures, and that's even better on a full frame camera. But just to let you know what you would be able to do when having such a lens, maybe for wedding photography, or if you're an advanced portrait shooter, a pretty nice deal. Also, when you get the cheaper version with an aperture of f4, you can buy it from Canon, you can buy it from Sony, and you can also buy it from Nikon as well. They all have a 70 to 200 millimeter, either with an aperture of f2.8, which is the more expensive one, or the one with an aperture of f4, which is the more affordable one. So let's continue. That's the Canon EOS R, and I'm using now the RF 50mm f1.2 lens. So f1.2 is pretty much the maximum we can find on the market. It has a huge front element, so a lot of light is passing through that lens, and that's why it's so expensive. You can expect to get a really crisp background, sharp photos, since it's a pretty new lens. And I'm gonna compare an aperture of f1.2, which is the maximum that this lens have, with an aperture of f1.8, From the previous lens, we were using the 50mm on the Canon EOS 77D. So let's start. So what's gonna happen if we open the aperture? f1.2, so the maximum available light that we have is now passing through that lens. So we opened the hole and now a lot of light passing through, because I would like to demonstrate how blur the background can be. So we do have enough ambient light available. Take an ISO of 100 since you don't need to compensate any missing light. And then the only setting left is the shutter speed. So you have to go really down with the shutter speed where we are here in the shadows. Let me see. I think a 640 of a second is pretty good because we are in the shadows. If we would be now in the sun, you probably would need a shutter speed of round about a 6,000, 8,000 of a second. Let's see what's gonna happen now. So my settings, f1.2, so the aperture open, a lot of light is passing through, blur background but less sharp, ISO 100 and a shutter speed of a 640 of a second. One problem that you might come across while using an aperture of f1.2 is that the camera focuses on the nose while the eyes are already out of focus. That's what's going to happen if you use a lens with such a fast aperture. To avoid that, you can stop down to approximately f1.8 and you would still get a pretty nice, decent blur background. So I still continue to take now a photo at f1.2 and then we're gonna compare it with an aperture of f1.8. So now the next example is that she is moving in the background. I tell her to turn around. So what do you think is the correct way of doing it? Do you need now a long exposure time or do you need a fast exposure time? The answer is you need a fast one since she's moving and we would like to freeze exactly this moment while she's turning around. So what I can recommend to have a sharp photo, we will use now a shutter speed of 1,000 of a second. We will use still the same aperture of f1.8, not to have something out of focus immediately just because she's turning, and we're gonna use a higher ISO setting since we need to compensate the light which will not pass through the lens since we're using an aperture of f1.8 and a fast shutter speed. So we have less light on our sensor since we're not exposing long enough. So that's why we're going to use an ISO setting of, let's try it out, like 320 or ISO 400 and see what's going to happen. So as you can see, these photos are sharp since we're using a fast exposure time. So these ones were the last examples. I hope you enjoyed this section of portrait photography. So remember, if you would like to take portrait pictures, make sure to use either a telephoto lens. The faster the aperture is, so the smaller the f number is, the more blur background you will get. Be aware that once you open the aperture, the less sharp your final image will get. So sometimes I can recommend close down the aperture a little bit, maybe from f1.8 to 2.8, or in this case f1.2 to f1.8. If you do have enough ambient light available, like we do have here, use the lowest ISO value you have, which results in a better image quality. And the only setting left that you have to think about is the shutter speed. By the way, so many people ask if I'm taking my photos in RAW or in JPEG. I always shoot in RAW, not in JPEG at all. The photos from this video were taken in JPEG because I would like to give you the straight out of the camera example. So I didn't do anything in post, but when I'm shooting, I take all my photos in RAW only, since I would like to have the option to do some post editing. RAW files contain in general more information, so you would be able to do much more in post editing, for instance in Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop, and that's why I take all my photos in RAW. If you would like to have just some great looking photos for your Instagram account or Facebook, you can take them in JPEG also, upload them to Instagram, use some filters. So JPEG would be still enough for doing such things. But I take my photos personally in RAW only. So boys and girls, it's already day 4 I'm shooting this video now, and we're here at the European Central Bank, or I'm sitting next to the European Central Bank, because behind the European Central Bank we have a big skate park. It's, I think, Frankfurt's biggest skate park that we have here. And today it's all about sport photography, so taking pictures of moving subjects. It doesn't matter if you would like to shoot someone playing football, it doesn't matter if you would like to take a photo of someone who's playing soccer, tennis, or if you're into spotting photography, so spotting airplanes. The first thing when it comes to moving subjects is what should pop up into your mind. You would like to take a photo of a moving subject. So something is moving, it's not stationary. Do you need a long exposure time or do you need a short exposure time? Remember, someone is running and you take a long exposure time, the moment is already gone because the person was moving. So that means you have to take a really short exposure time to freeze the moment. So first thing you should think about is the shutter speed. Second thing you should think about, because you're aiming for a good photo quality, is the ISO setting. If it's daytime, like that we have today, the sun is shining, we're at the European Central Bank skate park, there are no shadows, you should try to aim for a low ISO setting. So maybe ISO 100 will work out for you, since we do have enough ambient light available. And the third thing you should think about is the aperture. Do you want a blur background? So do you just want to have someone in focus and the rest out of focus? You should use an aperture which is open, so wide aperture. If you want to have someone sharp in the photo, also with a bit of background, you should close the aperture, so use a higher number, maybe f5.6, maybe f4, maybe f8. But what's going to happen if you close the aperture? You're going to lose some light since you closed the aperture. Then you require a fast shutter speed. I will tell you straight away, if someone is moving, you have to use at least a 1/500 of a second of your shutter speed, or even less, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 of a shutter speed. Maybe by the time we're getting there and the sun is still shining, you probably need a shutter speed of a 4,000 of a second, because otherwise the final image will be overexposed. But if you are taking a photo of someone who's playing football during the night in a stadium, maybe with just a little bit ambient light available, you still need a fast shutter speed, otherwise the person will be gone by the time you took the photo. So you require a fast shutter speed, at least a 1/500 of a second. Then it all depends on the lens that you have. Do you need a blur background? Then use the widest aperture you have. Maybe with the 70 to 200 millimeters, so the wide lens that I was using previously in this video, it has an aperture of f2.8. So it lets a lot of light passing through it. If you need a bit of background, so you can see the crowd behind someone who is playing soccer, for instance, use an aperture of f4 or 5.6. But then in fact you will lose some light, and since you're using fast shutter speed anyways, you might have to compensate the missing light with some ISO as well. Today I will do a couple shots for you, some with the Canon EOS R, that's the camera I'm filming at the moment with, and some with the really cheap one, the Canon EOS 7070. Today we're gonna use 2 lenses for this test, the 18 to 135 millimeter. So I will demonstrate you will be able to take great photos using this lens, and that's a cheap one. And secondly, we're gonna use the 24 to 105 millimeter. That's made for the bigger cameras, but you can use it also on the Canon EOS 7070. This lens has a fixed aperture of f4, so there's always the same amount of light passing through the lens. It doesn't matter if you take a photo at a focal length of 24 millimeter or if you zoom in all the way to 105 millimeter, there's always the same aperture of f4. However, you will be able to close it, but you can't use, for instance, an aperture of f2.8 since you're restricted by the lens, since it does only have an aperture of f4, which is enough for these kinds of shots that we're doing today. What lens would you usually use for these kind of sport scenes? If you need to go really close to your subjects, you can easily go with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. If you're like in a half pipe, it's kind of cool to have a fisheye lens, so if you can get really close to a skater, for instance. But in general, all the sport photographers out there or spotters, they usually take a telephoto lens, so starting at 70 millimeter, 70 to 200 millimeter. If you do have the money, get maybe a Tamron or a Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter lens. So let's head to the skate park. So we arrived here at the European Central Bank at the skate park. I met some really cool guys. They're helping me out by doing this video here. That's Laris, and he's holding at the moment the EOS 77D with the standard kit lens, which is the 18 to 135 millimeter. So you have a wide angle lens, but you can zoom in as well. At the moment, it's bright daylight, the sun is shining, so you need a fast shutter speed because you want to freeze the situation. If you have a long exposure time, your image will be probably overexposed, and by the time they're in the half pipe here, they are gone if you use, for instance, an exposure time of 1 second. So we're gonna start with a setting of 1600 of a second. We're gonna use an aperture of maybe 5.6. So we're closing the aperture, less light is coming through, the entire image gets more sharp, and it doesn't matter since we have a variable aperture if we're taking the photo at 18 millimeter or 135 millimeter. And then we adjust the ISO. We try to keep it as low as possible because we're aiming for the best image quality. And that's always possible by keeping the ISO as low as possible as well. So at the moment we have now the EOS 77D here, 1600 of a second, f5.6 and ISO 200, otherwise the image would be underexposed. And let's make some test shots here. So as you can see, we were using now a shutter speed of 1600 of a second, so we were able to freeze the moment because of the moving subject. Now at f5.6 we have a sharp 4 and a sharp background, and sometimes we were also using an aperture of 6.3, and we try to keep the ISO as low as possible. For the time being we were using ISO 200. Now to demonstrate what's going to happen if you use a longer exposure time, maybe at 250 of a second, we're going to compare these two images as well, and we're using a shutter speed also of 100 of a second. What's going to happen, we will expose the sensor for a bit longer. That means more light is passing through, and that means we have to close either the aperture or go down with the ISO as much as we can, but at the moment we can only use ISO 100. So that's what we're gonna do. First of all, we're gonna use a shutter speed of 100 of a second. We need to close down the aperture to get rid of some light since we're exposing longer, and we're using the lowest ISO that we can, which will be ISO 100. Just for demonstration that then your image won't be as sharp as using a faster shutter speed. Cool. And now we are taking some photos of a 50th of a second, which is obviously a longer exposure time, just to demonstrate that once you take photos of moving subjects, they won't be as sharp as using a faster shutter speed. Of course, then we have some more exposure on our sensor, so we need to close down the aperture, or we're gonna use a lower ISO value. So what we have done now, we switched to the Canon EOS R, and we are now using the 24 to 105 millimeter. We are taking now our photos at an aperture of f8, but we still want to get sharp and crisp photos. That's why we're still using the same shutter speed of 1600 of a second, but since we were exposing correctly the previous time, the final image would be now underexposed. That's why we have to use some ISO. In this case, we're gonna use an ISO setting of 640 to compensate the missing light. Since we closed the aperture from f5.6 to f8, we're still using the same shutter speed to get crisp photos, and that's why we have to compensate some missing light through a higher ISO value. So what did you learn today? When you take photos of moving subject, and it doesn't matter what is moving, if it's a soccer player, if it's a skater, if it's a car driver, if it's an airplane, all these kind of things are moving. The first thing you have to remember is use a fast shutter speed. Why? Because you want to freeze the moment. If you're using a longer exposure time, you have a high chance that the image is not sharp since your subject was moving. The second thing you need to think about is, do I have enough ambient light available? On a day like this, we have the sun which is shining and we do have enough ambient light available. And you should always aim for the best image quality by keeping the ISO as low as possible. The third thing is the aperture. Do you need a blur background? Open the aperture, and if not, close the aperture. The more you close the aperture, so the higher the number is, the more sharp the entire image will get. I can always recommend use an aperture of f4 to f8 if you're shooting sports. Let's assume you're on a football field and it's already dark and you just have some lights shining onto the field. There's probably not enough ambient light available. And you still need a fast shutter speed, at least a 500th of a second or even lower, like 1,000th of a second. If you can afford a lens with a wide aperture, make use of it to have the ISO as low as possible. Otherwise, you need to push the ISO till probably 1600, 3200 or even 6400. And here's the difference between a cheap camera and a big camera. If I am using the Canon EOS 70-70, which has a small sensor, you can't expect to get the same image quality as using a camera with a big sensor in low light, because a camera with a full frame sensor has always a better performance while taking photos during the night with low megapixels. So for instance, the camera we were using at the beginning, which was the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II, you can push the ISO up to 400,000. And let's assume you're in a stadium and you are using an ISO value of 6400. You can get better image performance than using the same ISO value on an aps-c sensor camera. So always try to keep the ISO as low as possible or appropriate according to the situation you're in. If you can afford a lens with a wide aperture, make use of it if you don't have enough ambient light available. And the first and highest priority is a sharp photo, so always use a fast shutter speed. Boys and girls, we're here in front of the skyline in Frankfurt, as you can see from the background. And now it's all about night photography. One of the most important things about night photography is, or the aim is, to keep the ISO as low as possible to get better results. Sometimes you have to increase the ISO. For instance, if you would like to take photos of moving subjects, or if you don't have a tripod by your hand. I am using a tripod for the moment, and I will give you now several examples of what's going to happen if I take a photo on low ISO values, what's going to happen with the aperture, and what do I need to take care of when it comes to the shutter speed. For the night scenes, I'm going to use two cameras, which will be the EOS 70-70 with the 18 to 135 mm with an aperture of f3.5 to 5.6. And I will use the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II, the full frame camera, to compare the image quality with the EOS 70-70. First of all, the aim should be to get the best image quality at all times, which results in having the lowest ISO value possible. Since we're using a tripod and the skyline is not going anywhere, so it's stationary, we can use an ISO value of 100, which is the lowest one that the Canon EOS 70-70 has. Secondly, we're using a kit lens, which is the 18 to 135 mm, which is not a lens with a fast aperture. So the lens itself doesn't allow you to have a lot of light coming through it. Since we have a tripod and the subject behind me is stationary and we always aim for the best image quality, we know already that we can keep the ISO as low as possible. So the ISO value is set to 100. The next photo I'm going to take will be at 18 mm. And I would be able to take the fastest aperture of f3.5. But I want to have more sharpness onto my image, and that's why I'm going to reduce the incoming light by closing the aperture once again. I think 5.6 is a really good value to start with. You can also use an aperture of f8, and we're going to do that, and I will show you what's going to happen if you use an aperture of f3.5, 5.6 and f8. So we're here on the Canon EOS 77D on the info screen, and as I told you, we are aiming for the best image quality, and that's why I'm using an ISO value of 100. And since we're using a tripod, it allows us to take a longer shutter speed. As I told you, I would like to take the next photo with an aperture of f5.6 to have a sharp image from the center to the edges, and basically the only component which is left is the shutter speed. So think of it, we're taking a photo of something which is not moving, so it's stationary. So since it's not running away, we can take a longer exposure time. So the mirror will open and it will expose the image for a longer time than compared to something which is moving, like a football player or something. And let's try out a shutter speed maybe of a second. So we're gonna expose the next image for 1 second. I'm going to go also into live view, see what's gonna happen. Here's my focus point, and now I will expose the image for 1 second. You as a human being are able to take photos out of your hand with a shutter speed of a 1/20 of a second, and you would still get sharp images. But since we're exposing the image for more than 1 second, you have to use a tripod or something similar to stabilize the camera. So let's use a shutter speed of 5 seconds. As you heard it, the mirror popped up and now it's exposing the sensor for 5 seconds. So the camera uses all the ambient light to expose the image. So the next example would be to close the aperture to get even a sharper image. And for this case, I'm gonna use an aperture of f8. We're still using an ISO value of 100. So now, since we're closing the aperture, so there's even less light passing through the lens, we have to use either a higher ISO value or we're gonna bump up the shutter speed, which I'm gonna do now because it's the most logic thing. So ISO value down to get best results and high quality images, f8 to get the sharpest image from the center to the edges, and we need now a longer exposure time. Let's take 10 seconds to compensate the missing light since we closed the aperture. So now the mirror popped up and the camera exposed the sensor for 10 seconds. Make sure not to hold on the tripod while doing so. And as you can see, the image looks like the one that we just took with an aperture of f5.6, but it's sharper from the edge to the center, and vice versa. We still used an ISO value of 100 for the best image quality, but we had to use a longer exposure time. Otherwise, the image would have been underexposed. And that's what I'm trying to demonstrate now. So if I use still an aperture of f8, and let's take the shutter speed that we were using before, let's say 5 seconds. So that's the photo. Same ISO value for the best image quality. f8 to have a sharp image from the center to the edges, and a shutter speed of just 5 seconds. And you can clearly see that the image is now underexposed. So let's assume you don't have a tripod by your hand at the moment, and you have to take the same photo out of your hands. So that means you can't hold your hand still for 5 seconds. But what you can do is you can open the aperture as much as you can, so a lot of light is passing through since you open the aperture. And the next thing is, I told you, you can hold your hands for like a 20 of a second. So that's a 20 of a second shutter speed. So the only component that you can change now is the ISO. And unfortunately, now you have to use a higher ISO value, since you can only hold your hand still for 20 of a second. You open the aperture as much as you can, so we're at 18 millimeter. And let's see what's going to happen if I would still use an ISO value of 100. you can't see anything. So let's bump the ISO. Let's say 6400. And as you can see, that's exactly the same photo, but in this case we had to use a higher ISO value since we were taking the same photo freehand. We couldn't hold the camera still for more than a 20th of a second. We had to open the aperture as much as possible to gain as much light through the lens as possible, but therefore we decreased the image quality since we were boosting the ISO to 6400. I can take the same photo with ISO 12800 to give you an example of how the image quality decreases. So that's 12,800 and the maximum of 25,600. And that's already overexposed. In a few moments I'm going to switch the camera from this aps-c sensor camera to the EOS 1DX. This one here, the aps-c sensor camera, has 24 megapixels and the EOS 1DX has 20 megapixels and it's full frame. So I'm going to switch to a bigger sensor with less megapixels, which is always favorable for taking photos at night. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to close the aperture to f4. I'm going to use an ISO value of 6400 as a good comparison value. I'm going to take a photo now to see what's going to happen. That's the photo. I think it's still a bit too dark, so let's use a 1/10 of a second. And I think that's a pretty good result. And let's switch to a full frame camera now. So here's the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II, and I'm using now the zoom lens, the 24 to 105 millimeters. So you have a wide angle lens, a normal lens and a telephoto lens combined in just a single lens with an aperture of f4 through the entire focal length. So guys, as you can see, that's the fastest aperture we can take is f4, so it's the widest aperture of this lens. And we're restricted by the lens since the aperture always depends on the lens you have. So as I told you before, we're gonna use ISO 100 for the best image quality. At the moment we're using f4, which will result in a sharp image, but we're gonna turn it down in a few seconds to f5.6 as well to get like the same results as like the ones taken with the EOS 7070. ISO 100 for the best image quality, f4 because we can't use a faster aperture because we're restricted by the lens. So let's use a longer shutter speed. Let's say 5 seconds and let's see what's gonna happen. So in my point of view, the image looks quite okay, but let's boost it to 6 seconds and take another example photo. So as you can see, this photo looks already quite nice, but let's make it a bit sharper by closing the aperture. And let's take the same as before, like on the Canon EOS 7070 at an aperture of f5.6 and f8. f5.6, ISO 100 since we're using a tripod and we're aiming for the best image quality. I'm still using a shutter speed of 6 seconds and let's see how the image looks like. You can guess if it will be overexposed or underexposed. And you were absolutely right, because since we closed the aperture, so less light is passing through the lens, it has to be underexposed. The only component that you can change now, since we're aiming for the best image quality, so we leave it at ISO 100, we have a tripod, and our subject, which is the skyline, is not moving, we're just taking a longer exposure time. Let's take 15 seconds and let's see how that looks like. And that's how the photo looks like. So let's zoom in. As you can see, the photo is sharp from edge to edge, and it's also sharp in the center since we were using an aperture of f5.6. And let's see what's going to happen if we close down the aperture to f8, and you can always see here on the side you have a little line which goes now into minus. Here is the 0 point, and if you're here with that little dot at the 0 point, the image will be correctly exposed. But just for this demonstration, we're gonna leave it at ISO 100 for the best image quality. We closed the aperture so less light is passing through the lens to have even a sharper image. And we take 15 seconds exposure time. As you can see, it's pretty dark, but it's even more sharper than the image we took at f5.6. And since we're aiming now still for the best image quality, leave ISO 100, leave f8, we're stationary, there's no subject moving, so we can use a longer exposure time of 30 seconds, and let's see what happens then. f8, sharp from edge to edge, 30 seconds of exposure time since we were stationary, nothing was moving, and we had a tripod to help us out. I told you at the beginning you can hold your hand still for a 20th of a second. That's what I'm going to do now. I will open the aperture so more light is passing through the lens. And as before, we're going to use a higher ISO value since we have to compensate the missing light through a faster shutter speed. So let's take ISO 6400. As you can see, it's pretty dark, so let's boost the ISO to 12,800. So this looks a bit better. And let's go to 25,600 just to compare these two photos. So, and this photo is overexposed. Now let's compare both photos with each other. The ones from the EOS 7070 and now the Canon EOS 1DX. Remember, the Canon EOS 1DX has a full frame sensor with less megapixels, which is always better for taking photos at night, since each pixel is bigger than the ones on an aps-c sensor camera. Much better performance using the Canon EOS 1DX, and even a better performance while taking the same photo at ISO 25,600. So let's summarize. If you have a tripod or something else where you can place your camera on to use a longer exposure time, always aim for the better image quality by keeping the ISO as low as possible. If you would like to have a really sharp image, use f5.6 to f8. But therefore, since you're closing the aperture so less light is passing through your lens, you have to use a longer exposure time to get all the available light onto your camera sensor. You can hold your hand still up to a 20th of a second. If you don't have any tripod by your hand, you may push the ISO a little bit more. Let's say 6400 is a good value also on newer aps-c sensor cameras, since they got much better within the last few years in terms of low light performance. If you have a full frame camera like the EOS 1DX Mark II or the Canon EOS 5D Mark II or the 60 or the Nikon D810 or Sony Alpha 7 III, they are full frame. So they are much better when it comes to low light shots, and by pushing the ISO a little bit further, since they have more space for the same amount of megapixels or even less megapixels, like seen here on the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II. You all may know the photos where the street lights appear like stars, and also with the cars, you know, when they're passing by and they have their lights on, that the lights appear like a snake. So one entire light, so one line, instead of a single light that you usually expect to see while taking a photo during the daytime. And to get that, remember the following. If you do something like that and you close your eyes and you squeeze them together and you're looking into some street lights, they appear like stars. So what did you do? You basically closed your eyes. So remember closing the aperture, it's the same basically. And then in fact you have to compensate the missing light by either pushing the ISO a little bit or use a longer exposure time. But since we're using a tripod at the moment, I will use a longer exposure time. and let's see what's gonna happen. Some lenses have a restriction also on the negative side, so some lenses allow you only to take a slowest aperture of f16, a minimum aperture of 18, and this one goes all the way down to f36, so it's really tiny and no light is basically passing through the lens. So we're using an ISO of 200, and let's take the longest exposure time for the moment, 30 seconds, and let's see what's gonna happen next. So the red light is indicating that the camera is working at the moment. I can recommend not to touch it because otherwise your image will get quite shaky, even while using a tripod. So the mirror popped up and now the camera is exposing the sensor for 30 seconds. And here is our photo. Unfortunately, no car was passing by, but as you can see, the street lights appears like stars. Let's take another one in the hope that there are some cars passing by. So same settings, 30 seconds, f22, ISO 200. Remember, we didn't want to freeze the situation. We wanted to have as much light as possible onto the camera sensor within 30 seconds. So the camera took all the available ambient light and it was basically freezing the last 30 seconds. If I would like to take now a sharp photo of a car which is passing by, what do you think do I have to do? First of all, we're gonna open the aperture to have as much light as possible. And while I zoomed in to 135mm, the fastest aperture I can get is f5.6. So 30 seconds will not help, otherwise the car is already gone. So we have to use a faster shutter speed. Let's take a 160 of a second. If I'm gonna take a photo now, it's super underexposed, so it's almost dark. So let's take a higher ISO value to compensate any missing light. So I took now several photos just to see what happened. So we had also some guys on a bicycle passing by. They are almost sharp, but obviously we reduced the image quality a lot since we had to boost the ISO now to 25,600. We used already the fastest aperture we could get with this lens, the 18 to 135mm, because we zoomed in as much as possible to 135mm, and the shutter speed at 100 of a second because we wanted to freeze the subjects which were moving. Actually, it's much better to have like a shutter speed of a 200 of a second or even 500 of a second, but therefore it would be underexposed, as you can see now. So that doesn't help. I took now several photos to see what's gonna happen. And as you can see now, the cars are freeze because we used a much faster shutter speed. We opened the aperture as much as possible, but of course we had to use a higher ISO value of 25,600 to compensate the missing light. By the way, on most cameras on the upper mode dial or inside the menu, you will have two modes that will help you to find the correct exposure even more quickly. On top of my Sony camera, there is the S and the A mode. S stands for shutter and A for aperture. M, as I told you in this entire video, is for manual. If you look on top of a Canon DSLR, you will have the M mode, the AV mode and the TV mode. AV is also aperture, A for aperture, and T, I don't know what T stands for here on this camera, but you can regulate the shutter speed. So how do these two modes will help you to find the correct exposure more quickly? Really simple. If you use aperture priority, that means you will set the aperture as you need it or as you like it. For instance, if you always take portrait pictures, open the aperture, so maybe f1.8 or f2.8. You can set the ISO value as you need it to. Remember, if you take a low ISO value, it will enhance your image quality. And if you do have enough ambient light available, you don't need to push the ISO. So aperture priority, what does that mean? Open the aperture if you want to take portrait pictures at all times. Use a correct ISO settings as you need it to, and the camera will set the correct shutter speed for you. That's always quite useful if you need an open aperture, if you always take landscape photography and you always want to take a picture which is sharp. So you may use an aperture value of f5.6, and the camera will always set the shutter speed accordingly. And on some cameras you will find an exposure compensation dial, or it's been realized digitally inside the camera, which is pretty cool. So if you think that your camera tends to underexpose most of the time, or it will overexpose. So for instance, here on the Sony camera, go towards the plus direction if you think that your image is slightly underexposed all the time. Take the minus value if you think that your camera is always overexposing your image. The other mode is the TV mode on Canon. On Nikon it's named something else, but it's the same function. And on the Sony it's called S, which stands for shutter. In this mode you can set the shutter speed, you can set the ISO to automatic or to the value according to the scenario you're taking photos of. And this mode is quite useful if you take pictures, for instance, of moving subjects. So go to your camera, set a shutter speed of 1,000 of a second or 2,000 of a second. If you want to take some photos of soccer players or football players, so in this case you would like to freeze the moment, so you need a really fast shutter speed. Take the ISO value which fits to the scenario. And remember, in this case, you are using already a really fast shutter speed, so there is no long exposure onto your sensor. Use an ISO value that fits to the scenario. And what I mean with that, if you use a fast shutter speed and you're taking photos at night, maybe push the ISO a little bit upwards if you don't have enough ambient light available. If you do have enough ambient light available, take a low ISO value. And the camera will set the aperture accordingly. And in most cases, the camera will open the aperture as much as possible. But in this mode, you're kind of lost a little bit because you can't regulate the fore and the background. And that's because most of the time, as I said, the camera will open the aperture to get all the ambient light available onto your camera sensor for the best image quality. And also in this mode, you do have an exposure compensation, which is in this case the aperture. So if you think that your image is always slightly overexposed, turn the dial, for instance here on the Sony camera, towards minus. So the camera will use a different aperture, so it will close it. And if you see that your image tends to be underexposed, go to the plus and your camera will use a faster aperture. So these modes are really useful if you have continuously changing light scenarios and you don't want to think about shutter speed or aperture at all times. Woo! Done! I hope this video will clear up all your thoughts about photography. Remember, if you know the relationship between ISO, shutter speed and aperture, you will be able to regulate or to control all the cameras on this planet. It doesn't matter if you have a digital camera or an old film camera. They all work about the same principle. However, if you do have any further questions, make sure to post a comment below. All the equipment I used for taking this video is listed in the video description below. Me as a non-native English speaker, I hope you understand what I meant in this video. And if you have any specific questions about a certain exposure when it comes to sport, portraits, or something else, just post a comment below. All the best from Frankfurt, Germany, and please make sure to subscribe, thumbs up if this video helped you. Remember to follow me on Instagram because there you can see which review comes next. Goodbye!